Hey, welcome to Seed of Dragons, and I am going to just spend a few minutes sharing a little reading from my favorite author, one of my favorite authors, Norman Maclean. And one of my questions always before I start reading anything is what makes a writer a good writer? What makes them worth reading? And Norman is just one of those guys. People just think of him, some people think of him as a writer of fishing, and he is that, but just a great writer. And so, if you've never thought of Norman Maclean or have read any of his stuff, I'm gonna read you a little excerpt from the novella "A River Runs Through It." It's there's two other stories in this collection that made him famous. Basically, he wrote at the end of towards the end of his life after he taught many years at the University of Chicago. The other two stories in this collection are Logging and Pimping in Your Pal Jim and USFS 1919, The Ranger, The Cook, and A Hole in the Sky. And these are great. I mean, they're also so incredibly historical because they take you back to the time before the war, World War II, when he was growing up in Montana. And there captures images and places and the people so incredibly well, but even more, just the style of the writing is absolutely incredible. This is towards the beginning of River Runs Through It, and he's describing his brother and the stories that his brother Paul likes to tell. Um, Here we go. My brother and I had fished the Big Blackfoot since nearly the beginning of the century. My father, before then, we regarded it as a family river, as a part of us, and I surrender it now only with great reluctance to dude ranches, the unselected inhabitants of Great Falls, and the Moorish invaders from California. Early next morning, Paul picked me up in Wolf Creek, and we drove across Rogers Pass, where the thermometer is that stuck at 3/10 of a degree short of 70 below. As usual, especially if it were early in the morning, we sat silently respectful until we passed the big divide, but started talking the moment we thought we were draining into another ocean. Paul nearly always had a story to tell in which he was the leading character, but not the hero. He told us his continental divide stories in a seemingly lighthearted, slightly poetical mood, such as reporters often use in writing, quote, human interest stories. But if the mood were removed, his stories would appear as something about him that would not meet the approval of his family, and that I would probably find out about in time anyway. He also must have felt honor bound to tell me that he lived other lives, even if he presented them to me as puzzles in the form of funny stories. Often I did not know what I had been told about him as we crossed the divide between our two worlds. You know, he began, it's been a couple of weeks since I fished the Blackfoot. At the beginning, his stories sounded like factual reporting. He had fished alone, and the fishing had not been much good, so he had to fish until evening to get his limit. Since he was returning directly to Helena, he was driving up Nevada Creek along an old dirt road that followed section lines and turned at right angles at section corners. It was moonlight. He was tired and feeling in need of a friend to keep him awake when suddenly a jackrabbit jumped onto the road and started running with the headlights. I didn't push him too hard, he said, because I didn't want to lose a friend. He drove, he said, with his head outside the window so he could feel close to the rabbit. With his head in the moonlight, his account took on poetic touches. The vague world of moonlight was pierced by the intense white triangle from the headlights. In the center of the penetrating isosceles was the jackrabbit, which, except for the length of his jumps, had become a snowshoe rabbit. The phosphorescent jackrabbit was doing his best to keep in the center of the isosceles, but was afraid he was losing ground. And when he looked back to check, his eyes shone with whites and blues gathered up from the universe. My brother said, I don't know how to explain what happened next, but there was a right angled turn in the section line road, and the rabbit saw it, and I didn't. Later, he happened to mention that it cost him $175 to have his car fixed. And in 1937, you can almost get a car rebuilt for $175. Of course, he never mentioned that, although he did not drink when he fished. He always started drinking when he finished. I rode part of the way down the Blackfoot, wondering whether I had been told a little human interest story with hard luck turned into humor, or whether I had been told he'd taken too many drinks and smashed hell out of the front end of his car. Since it was no great thing either way, I finally decided to forget it, and as you see, I didn't. I did, though, start thinking about the canyon where we were going to fish. This is a great example of what Norman Maclean does with his writing, which is he captures you, puts you in a story and stories inside of stories, and draws you in with this incredibly sharp, incisive writing that gets to the heart of the matter. He's not verbose. He doesn't get over his skis with too many words, but every now and then he captures the picture of this jackrabbit running in front of his brother's car in that isosceles, and his brother telling the story, and people telling stories to one another in the middle of the story is what makes it so beautiful. I hope that was helpful, and I hope you pick up a copy and enjoy it because it's great.